Hello, I'm Kevin Hunter with Kyle Torgerson. We are in the Northwest Digital News Studios, and we're going to talk about leasing cars today. A lot of people have questions about this, have been posed a lot of questions. On the channel, I have a lot of car content, and everybody's asking us to get something published on leases. So we're here to deliver.
Lovely. Okay. So Kevin, I do have some questions for you, if that is all right.
Excellent.
Fantastic. So when do you tell the dealer if you are interested in leasing a vehicle?
That is a fantastic question. And here's the thing. I have mentioned to many people will ask the same question, like, when do I tell them that I have all cash when I'm going to, if I'm a cash buyer? And I tell people till the very end, negotiate the price of the car first. Then when you go sit and finance, tell them you got cash. Well, the response is exactly the same for leasing. Negotiate the price of the car first, and then when you go sit and finance, you tell the finance manager, hey, quote me a lease for this as well. The reason why you're doing this is that very commonly, and a really huge majority of people that lease a car end up leasing the car at full sticker MSRP because they just think it's a lease program and they don't ever bother to ask about the price of the vehicle. So you will pay a higher lease payment because you started by asking about leases instead of negotiating the price of the car first. So just because you're leasing doesn't mean you don't have to negotiate the price of the car you're going to lease.
Okay. So how is a lease different than buying a car?
In a lot of different ways, because when you buy a car, of course, you own it. When you lease a vehicle, you don't own the vehicle. You get to use it for a given term, and those terms can run a variety of lengths. Some people will actually lease a vehicle for as short as 6 months, but the more common ones are 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, 39 months, usually in that area. Anything longer than 24 months is considered a longer term lease. But you don't own the car when you're leasing it, and you will return it at some given time unless you decide to buy it after your lease ends. Now, the cool thing is that the whole time you're paying on this lease, you know what the purchase price of your vehicle would be because that's established right in your lease contract. It's established what the price of your car is. So I've had some people ask me, should I think about buying the vehicle at the termination of the lease? Well, I tell them, if, as an example, your end lease value is $15,000 and you drive the car for your 36 months and you get to the end of that time frame and you look at your vehicle with the miles it has on it, compare that to other used car prices in the market, and if your car happens to be either comparable to those prices or less, then consider buying the car that you were leasing. You know who's been driving it, who's been taking care of it, consider buying it then.
Okay. So what about upfront costs? What's the difference between there?
Well, there's things that you will pay upfront along with a number of other things, but the main things, if you're buying a car, of course, you're going to have your down payment. People are aware of zero cash down financing terms. Don't recommend that you take advantage of that. You're going to be taken advantage of if you do that. So the upfront costs would be cash down, and then your common ones, tax, title, license, if you're buying the car. Now, what's a little bit different with a lease is your first month's payment could be due at the time that you do the lease. They may have a refundable security deposit. And part of that is just things for damages, wear and tear, things like that. And there could be an acquisition fee. So on top of those things, then come your tax, title, license, just like you're buying a car. So those are your typical upfront costs for a lease.
So now that we're talking about money and we just talked about the upfront costs, what about monthly costs?
The monthly payment?
Yes.
Yeah, the monthly payment that you have on a lease generally tends to be less than a monthly payment that you'd have if you were purchasing the vehicle. And the reason being is quite simple. When you're buying a car, you're buying the entire value of what the vehicle is. When you're leasing a vehicle, you're only paying for whatever percentage of the vehicle you expect to use. So to explain that, if you sign a lease that says you can use up to 12,000 miles a year and you're going to lease it for 3 years, well, they, based on those projections, say you're going to use 36,000 miles of that vehicle for 3 years. They estimate its depreciated value at the end of 3 years, and your lease will be based on that money only, not what the additional value is the car is worth at the end of its term. So as a general rule, the monthly payment on a lease will be less.
Okay, that's pretty cool. What about charges, taxes, and fees?
Charges, taxes, and fees. Well, they're a little bit different. If you're going to finance, finance will have when you're talking about fees, there can be things like rent charges. There can be other fees that are relative to wear and tear type things. You can get to the end of your lease and find out that you have some expenses for things that you didn't incur if it was just a used car. And some of the classic ones, they go around the car and they look at it with a very fine-tooth comb. You know, is there excess wear on your tires? You know, do the tires seem like they have more wear than is normal on them? You know, are there fine scratches? Did you drive it down the dirt road to your uncle's place and whatever else? It got a few rock chips down on the running boards, and, you know, maybe a fir bough or something touched the side of it, unless I'm really fine. So you could end up with some other charges at the conclusion of your lease. So you do have to make sure that that car is pretty well cared for. And don't let your kids spill the ice cream on the back seat and, you know, dump over the coat or Coke rather on the floorboards, things like that. They can come back and bite you on a lease. You can say that in theory you end up paying for that on a used car too, because you trade in the used car and somebody looks at its condition and says, well, I think it's worth less than so-called perfect retail. So those charges kind of exist there too. So
if I get tired of the car that I'm leasing, right, is there early termination? And yeah,
you can, you know, the thing is that on a car that you purchase, obviously you can do early termination. And that's really simple by, let's say I, you know, put 10% down, I finance the car for 60 months, and 2 years into owning the car, I get tired of it and decide to trade it in. I'm cashing out of it, right? I'm terminating it early, or I sell it to somebody else. I've also terminated early. You can terminate a lease early a couple different ways. If you bring it back to the dealership, though, expect to pay some early termination fees. That could get a little expensive. But there's also something that a lot of people who want to terminate a lease early don't think about. Let's say you leased a vehicle and you did a 24-month lease, and you get 12 months into it and you're going, I'm getting kind of tired of this car. I'd like to get something else. But maybe one of your friends really likes the car. If they're qualified to do a lease as well, you can take them in with you. You can actually do what's called a lease swap. Now, not everybody does that, but a big chunk of them do have that available. So you can actually go in and roll over the balance of that lease to somebody else, do a lease swap. You're out. Go lease another car, go buy another car, whatever you want to do.
Cool. So still talk about termination. What about vehicle termination?
Well, you're going to have to, if you own it, you're going to have to deal with either trading it in or selling it if you want a different one. If you're going to terminate a lease, we'll expect to have lease end costs. You're going to have to pay any of the whatever associated fees are there. And then, as I said, just some of your wear and tear type things like the condition of the car and wheel fees. So you will have some fees associated with the lease. And of course, if you own it, you're going to have to either sell it or trade it, you know, whatever.
Now, everyone knows when you drive off a lot with a car, you know, it starts losing money, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about future value?
Future value is an interesting thing. Now, here's a little thing about buying and leasing that is quite similar. There's a reason why when you drive a car off a lot that it suddenly becomes worth less money. Okay, when it's sitting on the lot, it falls within a class of what's called dealer retail. And that's true of it either being new or it being a used car, but it's sitting in the dealer retail class. Now, you drive it off the lot. Part of that depreciation that's happening is happening because the dealer had a built-in profit on that vehicle. You drive off the lot and now your vehicle has what's called a actual cash value. Now, for people who are going, well, I bought this yesterday, the car is suddenly worth less today. No, there's actually something magical, not necessarily magical, but there's something that has to happen in the background that creates that depreciation number that happens. the title of the vehicle has to be transferred in the state you reside in to you, the buyer. Now, that can take as little as 7 days. I've seen situations where it took 30 days, even 60 days before that. This depends on how much on the spot the dealer is. But as a general rule of thumb, the title is never going to be transferred to you, the buyer, for at least a period of 7 days. So for people who have, whether it's buyer's remorse on a vehicle you're buying or lease remorse, you decided, a couple days after you signed the lease and you drove off and you go, oh, shoot, you go back to the dealership. If the dealer said, hey, this is yours, there's no way out of it and stuff like that, you go, let's contact the state and see if my title's been transferred yet. The answer will be no, and the title's still in their name. There's no consequence to them whatsoever to take that car back, put it back in the inventory, notify the state that the title is not transferring, and there's no loss in value from retail to a used car status, so to speak. So it's the transferring of the physical transferring of the title that actually causes that, moves the vehicle from a retail value to a private party value. In other words, a used car. And that happens when the title is transferred. So it doesn't happen the day you drive off the lot. That's an important thing to know, even when you're making insurance adjustments or things like that to your car. Depreciation doesn't happen the minute you drive off the lot.
Now,
oh, wait a minute. Let me go back to something you mentioned about future value. I want to make sure that I touch on this because I mentioned this just a moment ago, that future value on a leased car is actually determined in the beginning of the lease. So if you say 15,000 miles a year is what I'm signing up for, and then I'm doing a 24-month lease, they're going to look at 2 years down the road, and they have this stuff figured out. 2 years down the road, at 30,000 miles, the car is worth X. That's going to be your future value of that car. When your lease term is done, you could decide to buy or not buy the car, but its future value is going to be determined on the lease. On a used car, that's quite different. It's going to be, things along the same lines. I'm not saying that it's completely different, but it's along the same lines. But whatever the market will bear at that given time, so it could be a number that's significantly above whatever this so-called lease number is they come up with, or it could be a number that's lower. It all depends upon how skilled you are at negotiating a car you're trading in, or how good you are at just selling your car to a private party. So those are the differences in future values.
You brought up a point that I kind of want to touch on. You brought up mileage. Can you go more detail how that affects things?
Yeah, well, here's something to know about. Let's talk about if you purchase a vehicle first. If you own the car, you can drive as many miles as you want. Obviously, that's kind of a no-brainer. But you have to remember something about depreciation. There's a standard given number of miles that a normal person drives. That's going to be somewhere in that 12 to 15,000 miles a year. You'll notice that when you book a vehicle out on whether you use an NADA or Kelly or Black Book, it doesn't matter which one you use. You'll notice that if it shows you a little bit lower value than what you expected, it will say a $800 adjustment for excessive miles. Or you might, on the flip side of that, let's say you only drive like 7,000 or 8,000 miles a year and you're 2 years down the road and you only have 16,000 miles on it, it might give you a bonus for very low miles given the year that that's at. Now, as far as the lease is concerned, so let's talk about that for a moment. As far as the lease is concerned, you generally specify those miles up front. So whether it's 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, those are some of the common brackets. You can also negotiate for a higher number of miles. But let's say you go, well, I don't know. Here's the thing to know about a lease. If I say I want a lease based on 15,000 miles, I better use the 15,000 miles. Or if I only use 10, I'm still going to pay for 15,000 miles. No questions asked. So what I tell people to do is look at what that per mile cost actually is. And, whatever that factor might be. On a lease, the only thing they're going to do if you go over on your miles is pay you X number of, you're going to have to pay in X number of cents for all your miles over the given number of miles you negotiated for up front. So let's say you negotiate for 15,000 miles and you only drive 10, you get still charged for 15,000 miles. Let's say you negotiate for 10 and you end up driving 12 you'll pay those 10,000 miles in your lease like you did, and you'll have a little bit of money extra to pay for those additional 2,000 miles. So that's the way it works. The miles still work out in the end. And again, going back to owning a vehicle, that's just going to, more miles just depreciate the car more, less miles depreciate it less. Pretty simple.
Earlier, you also talked about wear and tear, excessive wear and tear. Can you go in more detail about that?
Yeah, wear and tear on a vehicle, on a used vehicle, if you own it, obviously you don't have to worry about that too much in terms of somebody gigging you down the road, but just think a little bit about, you hear somebody advertise a used car and they'll say, one owner, extremely low miles, really well cared for, in showroom condition. Guess what? The car is worth more because it has very minimal wear and tear. It looks next to a new car. At the same token, let's say that vehicle is bought by somebody who's pretty tough on cars, likes to take 30 miles an hour corners at, 50, 60, 80, whatever on a regular basis. The mechanically, the vehicle feels a little sloppy, whatever. That's excessive wear and tear. And on a used vehicle, if you own it, is going to affect the end value of your car. Well, the same is true on the leases, as I mentioned earlier, and the lease companies will hold you responsible. That's actually a really good thing to ask whoever you're leasing the vehicle from. Good thing to ask them. What are the things that I need to look for, that I need to be aware of? Because I've seen people get dinged financially on, hey, your oil changes weren't exactly on the interval we were looking for, or they can be fine line scratches, or there looks to be a little more wear on the fabric in the seats. So some of the downside to leasing is the lease companies can tend to be pretty doggone picky on those. And I really recommend, because the lease companies will actually send somebody out to inspect the car and then give that information to the dealer. I really recommend that you set up an appointment with the dealer when you're going to bring that car back on the lease. You're getting to the end of the terms and you plan on giving them the vehicle back. Go in maybe a month beforehand and say, hey, my lease is up next month. I'm going to be back at this time with the vehicle. Can you have the representative out who's going to inspect the car so I can be there when he's looking at it? You probably come out on a little better on that car inspection when it's all said and done if you do that. So think about that.
Okay, so the lease just finishes, whether it's 12 months, 24, 36, but it's now the end of the term of the lease. What happens? What's going on?
Well, the lease is done. I mentioned that the value of the car is determined at the beginning of the lease, so you knew all along what it was. I recommend that if you're thinking about buying it, that a month or two out from your lease ending, that you start shopping your own car in the used car market and looking to see what your car, with its miles, its year, everything else, is selling for in the open market. Now, you might find out that on your lease, your car says its end value is, let's just use $15,000, and you find out that a car, the year of your vehicle with its mileage and everything else, is selling for $11,500 right now in the market. Should you buy the car?
Maybe, yeah.
I confused you, did I?
I'm way confused.
Yeah, if your lease value says $15,000, and that's what you'll pay no matter what, and your car is in the used car market, any other car, same mile, same make, same year, everything else, is selling for $11,500, you probably want to think about buying one of the cars out in the market. Unless you put so much value on the fact that you were the one driving it in the last 2 years, 3 years, whatever it might be, then maybe that little extra money is worth it to you. But I tell people, shop it in the open market and see what your car is selling for before you decide to buy that car at the end of the lease.
So people like to customize their car, especially around this area.
Yep.
How does that work with a lease? Like, does that affect anything at all?
Yeah, you can, whether buying or leasing, you can customize your vehicle to a certain extent. Obviously, you have less flexibility with a lease than you do with buying a vehicle. If you buy a vehicle, you can do whatever you want to it. But here's the thing about a lease. If you're thinking about some custom options for your vehicle, lease it with that work already having been done. The last thing you want to do is drive your vehicle into the dealership at the end of the lease and go, oh, by the way, I put some custom rims on here you know, some stock tires, I did some striping, whatever else. Oh, that's going to cost you big time. They want it back exactly as they got it. You don't get to customize it after you sign those documents. It's yours, and they want it back just the way they leased it to you. Now, if you're going, well, I'm going to buy it anyway at that, well, then who cares? Again, you're thinking about ownership, but they do want the vehicle back. So when I mentioned that you can customize it, so let's say I was going to lease a F-150 Ford truck, and I look at the stuff they got on the lot. I don't want to order something special. So you can even lease a car you order. That's possible to do. So let's say that it's out on the lot, and I'm going, well, I'd really like a tow package, running boards, a box liner, box cover, you know, maybe some fog lights out front. Talk to the dealer, get it all installed on the truck, then lease it. Lease it like that. But don't go out and try to change the vehicle after the fact. It's going to cost you every time if you do that.
Okay.
I've seen some guys come into the lot and go, hey, you know, look at this cool vehicle and everything else, and they're like, I got $4,000 in wheels in it and blah blah blah, and the lease representative or the dealer person's going, where's the stock tires? And they're like, I sold them on Craigslist or whatever. Like, we don't want those tires. We want our tires back. It's like, wow. So yeah, can be tough.
Now, with the lease, how is a money factor different from an interest rate?
Money factor, that's a big deal. You have to realize that money factors are what are calculated in leases, not interest rates. They're actually very similar, though. A money factor, if you convert it to an APR, which is the annual interest rate that you're paying, but it can be comparable to, if not lower than, whatever the national loan interest rate is. So money factors generally tend to be a little bit less than interest rates. But you can't just take a money factor and go, okay, this is the same as the interest rate. It's really not. What they do is they take the depreciation of the vehicle. So they take whatever the term of the lease is that you're going to have, let's say 24, 36, 39, or even 48 months, which is kind of an unusual lease. And then they calculate the interest rate simply by multiplying a factor of 2,400. Now, I don't have the complete explanation as to why they use that number and what that all relates to. You know, there can be, you know, huge lease experts out there that maybe have that answer. And if you're watching this video and you have an explanation for the factor of 2,400, feel free to put it in the comment section below the video. But so they calculate it out. It tends to be relatively close to what the interest rate is, if not a little bit better than what the going interest rate is out there, and of course for better qualified buyers.
So with all this talk about, you know, interest rates and lease and all that, are there any special buyer qualifications to lease a car?
There are. There's things to know about buying a car, that these advantages you do not have relative to leasing. So if you're familiar with the tiers of financing, there are what are called prime lenders, and those prime lenders tend to loan money to people with 680 credit scores and above. And some prime lenders are even high, so don't be surprised if somebody says we don't borrow to anybody below a 720 score. But as a general rule of thumb, it's 680 credit scores and above. And if you go to websites like bankrate.com and other places like that, where you can find banks who post their daily rate online, those are all based on 680 credit scores and above. And of course, they take into things like, you know, what your debt to income ratio is and things like that. But in buying a car, you have your prime lending, you have your subprime lenders, you got your deep subprime lenders. Deep subprime are people with pretty significant amount of either no credit or damaged credit, and it's a very limited number of bankers that are willing to finance a car like that. Interest rates tend to be really high, that sort of thing. Well, when you look at leasing companies, they don't, for the most part, really have anything that either relates to subprime or deep subprime. So if you're thinking about leasing a vehicle, good to have that credit score at 680 or above, or like I said, in some cases, they're going to want something even higher. And they're going to look at debt to income ratio, you know, like what some of your other expenses are, you know, can you actually even afford this payment in the other financial commitments that you have out there already? And of course, things like cash down help all of that too. So anyway, for the most part, leasing a car, if you want to lease, you're going to have to be in that upper bracket of the more qualified buyers on the market.
Now that's all the questions that I have today. Of course, there'll probably be more comments in the comment section, more questions. So if you do have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and next time we'll get to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And any questions that you may have relative to car buying, whether it's dealing with finance, whether it's how to negotiate, you know, the purchase price of your vehicle, what do you do about getting a trade evaluation? Things to know about banking. And we talked a week ago about some of the things that you should do, that you should know up front before you even start car shopping. The thing to know, whether you're buying, leasing, new or used, it doesn't matter. Whatever your purchase preferences are, always remember, informed and knowledgeable car buyers always get a better deal. So make sure you do your homework first. I'm Kevin Hunter with Kyle Torgerson here on Northwest Digital News. Thanks for joining us on this session talking about leasing versus buying. Till next time, take care.